Hello and welcome back for Module 10. We are veering into fiction, finally. This is my personal favorite for many reasons, some of which I will share with you over the next few weeks. In this module, we are going to look at the idea of creating scenes and how to best do that in a narrative. So even though I said we're moving into fiction, a lot of what we cover here can also be used in creative nonfiction as well. But just to be clear, for this week's module, we are looking exclusively at fiction. The one crucial thing we have to understand when we talk about scene is the difference between plot and story. In fact, is there actually a difference? Yes, there is. There once was a famous English author named E.M. Forster who wrote such classics as A Room with a View and A Passage to India. By the way, if you want to see the 1985 version of A Room with a View, it has a 19-year-old Helena Bonham Carter in it, and she is the actress who played Bellatrix Lestrange in the Harry Potter movies. You won't recognize her. Anyway, E.M. Forster, his take on scene and story and plot is this. A story is the chopped off length of the tapeworm of time, a narrative of events in their time sequence. A plot is also a narrative of events, the emphasis falling on causality. Then he gives the famous example, a story is the king died and then the queen died. It gives us that narrative of events in time sequence. But if we say the king died and then the queen died of grief, then we are talking about plot. The time sequence is preserved, but the causality, why she died, overshadows those facts. Plot is a structural device. Another way to distinguish the difference is to ask the following questions. If it's a story, the natural question to ask is, and then what happened? But if we ask, why did that happen? We've got a plot. The whole idea here, again, is causality. Why do we have the interest in what is happening? And if you like this picture, this was taken in Fontevraud Abbey in France. It is where King Henry II, who was the King of England, but really only spoke French. It was the Middle Ages. And Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine are buried. And it's pretty cool to see them there. You might have heard of Freytag's pyramid when talking about plot structure. Burway calls it the inverted check mark. We have the story of Cinderella plotted out here for us. The beginning shows the conflict that's going on between Cinderella and her stepmother. There's the invitation to the ball, and of course, the stepmother tells Cinderella she cannot attend. We have further complications as the story moves forward. The fairy godmother intercedes, tells her to be home by midnight, and the prince falls in love with her. You know how it goes. But then, the clock strikes 12, Cinderella flees and drops her slipper, and the prince finds it. Then everyone has to try on the slipper, which leads to further complications, and the stepmother urging her own daughters while forbidding Cinderella from trying it on. Ultimately, the crisis, or what we might call the climax of the story, is when Cinderella gets at last to try on the slipper and it fits. After that, we have the falling action of the wedding and the resolution of the prince and Cinderella living happily ever after. Most stories can be plotted in a somewhat similar vein, especially the kinds of stories we are looking at in this class. The way to think about scenes is that they are really the building blocks of fiction. A scene is a sequence where a character or characters engage in some sort of action and or dialogue, or both. Scenes should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, a mini story, if you will, and should focus around a definite point of tension that moves the story forward. That beginning, middle, and end of the scene itself is very important as we go forward. If we look at the story of Cinderella, we can examine the certain scenes that happen. But how do we know when a new scene is starting? Our clues are the point of view changes, meaning we are seeing a new character or new characters are added in. 2, the setting, or 3, the time changes. Scenes are really easy to see in sitcoms like The Big Bang Theory or Friends. When we move from Leonard and Sheldon's apartment into the hallway or Penny's door, that is changing scenes. Or when we move from Monica and Rachel's apartment to the coffee shop, that too is a scene change. In fiction, it can be a little bit more confusing, but we are going to look at specifically what is a scene and what is summary, coming up next. Summary and scene are methods of treating time in fiction. A summary covers a relatively long period of time and in a short distance, whereas a scene deals at length with a relatively short period of time. Another way to think about scene or showing is to think of the opposite of telling, which is a summary. Let's look at an example to make this more clear to you. Let's take a look at these two examples. The first one is telling. Everyone who lived in Beverly, Arkansas seemed to carry secrets. In such a small town, inhabited by a significant population of tenacious aging veterans from long-forgotten wars, mystery lived in each closet and sideboard of the cluster of houses lining the streets. Not much had happened in the last 3 decades, but September 10th, 1994 marked a change that would long be remembered on the village calendar, the day Joe Popwheel captured a bank robber. This has given you the current setting. We know we are in a bank in a small town in Arkansas in the 1990s, but it also goes back in time when it says, in the last 3 decades, not much has happened. And in fact, it even goes back to an unspecified time in that it tells us about long-forgotten wars. This is telling. There was no dialogue. There was no real character development. However, this next part is an example of showing. It gives us the beginning of the scene. Here's showing. Old Joe stood in line at the Beverly First Bank and Trust. The warmth of the September morning had been unexpected, and his red and gray flannel shirt felt damp at his armpits and collar. "Hey, Joe," says Shirley Macon, the head teller. "Are you here to get out all your money?" Joe had just started to laugh when he heard an order bark from the back of the bank. "Everyone freeze! On the floor! Now!" That's just the opening to the scene, but you can already see there are characters, there is dialogue, even a little bit of personality. I hope you can see that there is a way to tell your reader something and a way to show them something. In showing, you will see there are significant concrete details included. We see Joe standing in line at the bank. We see his red and gray flannel shirt. We hear the conversation banter between Joe and Shirley, the bank teller. So let's look at the story you were asked to read this week and see if we can break down the scenes and the summary in it. So, The Littlest Hitler. The story is told by an older Davy who remembers the time when he dressed up as Hitler for Halloween. He talks about making the costume and even what started it. He had been watching a retrospective about World War II on TV, and he provides some interaction with his father. We would call this summary exposition. The first real scene where we see action unfolding is when Davy gets on the school bus and some of the older boys salute him, causing a disruption. We have conflict. The tension begins to rise as he gets to his school classroom. He says his teacher seems slightly amused by the costume, but the teacher has both Davy and Lisette, who is dressed as Anne Frank. The teacher has them both explain their costumes and give some historical context, and immediately the conflict is heightened. By the time we get to the playground, more kids are upset and starting to take sides, a lot of them against Davy. The next big scene is the parade. The teacher tries to help Davy, who has shed his mustache and armband. She gives him a wig to wear so he can go as an old man. Davy, humiliated and upset, calls himself Lint. When he gets home, we get a little bit of summary. We understand the living situation he and his father have, and that Davy's mother is no longer on the scene. His dad is sorry that he had such a tough time and rather surprised by Davy's classmates' reactions. So they get in the truck and go to the store to get Davy a new costume. The next scene is at the store. The scene is different from the truck because we changed places. They have to take what is left, and Davy is disappointed to get a torn Frankenstein mask, and he and his father have a few sharp words. The next scene is at the school at the Harvest Carnival. The scene does start with a general summary, but further down the page, Davy ends up in the maze with Cindy, an older girl that he's a bit attracted to, and of course, that goes awry as well. Kid's just not having a good day. The next scene is Davy and his father leaving the carnival to go trick-or-treating, and in there we get a lot of summary of the aspects of their lives. We learn that Davy doesn't have to follow a lot of the typical childhood rules, and he recognizes that they are not like other families. This is heightened when we get to the story Crisis. And you might think this is an odd story Crisis because nothing earth-shattering happens, but it does take place at the scene at the Friedlanders' home, the only Jewish family in town, where Davy sees into their lives. He feels sorry for the children who have to be homeschooled, and he possibly feels guilt over what he now understands was a mistake to dress as Hitler for Halloween. It's not explicitly stated, but he does say he wants to give them all of his candy. By the time they get back home, which is our next scene, he talks with his dad a little bit. Dad tucks him in and Dad goes off to bed. The last scene is Davy alone in the basement by the furnace, where he does this very odd thing of sticking his hand in as far as he can stand it, and we have the resolution. That's pretty much how you break down a story into scenes, an exposition or summary, and now it is your turn. Refer back to this lecture if you need guidance when you do your own assignment for this week's module. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week. Bye.